So today's workshop, we're going to talk about how virtual interviewing is kind of the new normal and how some of it's going to stick around even when the pandemic lifts. We're going to talk about some preparation tips, and then we're going to talk, and this is going to be a mix of just general interviewing concepts that apply to however your interview is, in person, on the phone, virtual, but also a lot about virtual. What can you do to make the virtual interview go as well as possible? And I've already talked about, please think of some questions. Okay, I want to have a little poll and just kind of where you are right now with what you think about virtual interviewing compared to in person. This is anonymous, so I'm not gonna know who votes for what. Okay, we just had a new person join, so I'll just give a little bit more time for this poll. Hi, Ryan, welcome. I just saw you join. There is a poll I just launched if you want to participate. I'm about to close this, so I'll give you a few, maybe 5 seconds, 10 seconds to, if you had a thought on that question. Okay, so almost everybody's responded. I will share the results. So a lot of you, the majority, but only by one vote, was that you think that virtual interviewing is easier. I actually personally agree. I think there's something, it gives a little bit of distance between you and the interviewers, and it might not be so intimidating, but there's also some other benefits to virtual interview I'm going to go through. So virtual interviewing, some people don't like it. It's harder. 4 of you voted that it's harder. And I totally get that. Sometimes, especially when you maybe are an extrovert or that you're used to talking to people in person, it's easier to develop a comfort level. You're seeing all the nonverbals. So I totally get it, but there could be some advantages to virtual interviewing, which I'll talk about. Okay, so the new normal. So this, while of course a lot is affected right now, some of this is not going away. And virtual interviewing is going to increase because employers are realizing that they can interview candidates, still learn quite a bit. Maybe it's not as good as in person, but a lot of jobs, professional jobs, like say you apply for a job in New York, that company would normally fly you out, put you in a hotel, maybe for 1 night, maybe for 2 nights, just for an interview that maybe you got the job or maybe you didn't. That could be $1,000 or more, certainly hundreds of dollars for a lot of cases. So I think a lot of employers are going to start doing more and more virtual interviewing. And some employers have decided with COVID that they're going to permanently work remotely, like Twitter, Nationwide Insurance. I think there's some others. And I think a lot of companies are going to do hybrid as well. Companies are realizing that they're going to save money on office space, save time. A lot of people like not having to commute. Now, virtual work doesn't work for everybody. It can be very isolating, it can be hard to be productive. So companies are going to have to figure out how to make that work. But also, virtual meetings are going to be more commonplace. And part of that's just the fact that the bigger the company, the more likely you're going to have multiple sites. So the point is this, that this virtual thing, unfortunately, if you don't like it, it's not going away. So you might as well get used to it, get some practice with it, get more comfortable with it. For an example, even if COVID goes away, I had an interview last year where I had a hybrid, where I had in person, but we also had an online audience as well. So that's probably going to happen too. So it can increase the access for people that want to participate in an interview, whether you're the interviewee or the interviewer. Some pros and cons for you. And so no travel, you can save a lot of time. And as we saw, some people might experience less anxiety compared to in person. You can do a little bit of using the environment for your benefit. I have this wall behind me. I could create some keywords or maybe some little hints on reminding myself on like my three top skills, or maybe three words that help me remember an outline to an interview answer. Now, you don't want to like write a script and start reading the script as you're doing the interview. But if it's something that's very subtle and it may be helpful, that's something that you can do. It's not cheating, unless you're going to read a script or try to use something like a teleprompter or something. So just you can use a little bit of that for your advantage. You can also use your phone as a stopwatch to just kind of see how you're doing with your answers. You don't want to have answers that are long. A good rule of thumb is like 90 seconds, maybe 2 minutes. Shorter is fine if you're saying everything you need to say. But yeah, I wouldn't go with super short because you're thinking like, oh, I'm saving them time. You want to make sure you're saying all the things you want to be saying that represent yourself in the best way, that demonstrate your strengths and the values that you bring to that job role. Drawbacks of virtual interviewing, technical issues. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. Wi-Fi access may be a concern for you. It might be hard to find a quiet space. And I've actually suggested to a student that just didn't have an opportunity to find a quiet space that, well, if sometimes libraries might have a room you can reserve and then you can use their Wi-Fi as well. I've also, when there was no other alternative, it would be better to do an interview in your car than doing it in a loud room where you're constantly distracted and the interviewer is having to ask you to repeat things. It's totally fine. And in fact, you could say to the interviewers, like, hey, I'm sorry I'm doing this in my car, but I wanted to make sure that I had a good connection with you and no distractions. I'll bet that they are going to appreciate it compared to you doing it in a loud environment. And another drawback is some people prefer the in-person, so it kind of goes both ways. So preparation tips, we're going to go through each of these. So setting up your environment, setting up your technology, using the job description as a way to predict a lot of the questions you're going to get. Researching the employer, that can help with understanding maybe some questions they're going to get, but also understanding what they're about and maybe generating questions for them. How to approach interviewing, how to have a good mindset, some tips on that. Common interview questions, and then some examples of specific interview questions. Most interviews are going to have a combination of these general questions that you're going to find in a lot of interviews, and then questions that are very specific for that job that you're interviewing for. The STAR format, some of you may have heard of it. It's a way to answer a specific type of interview questions, which we call behavioral based, and we're going to go through that. And then I have some examples of questions that you can ask interviewers. And that's something you always want to have. If they ask you if you have questions for them, say yes, and try to have some good questions set up for them. So the environmental setup, now the ideal would be something like over here on the right on this picture. Now, I'm not saying you need to spend a bunch of money, but some of this stuff is not that expensive. I've seen light rings, maybe not this fancy, for $20. This looks like a professional microphone that might be $50, $60 and up. I'm not saying you need to do that. I just use this for all my workshops and all my meetings, and I think the audio sounds good. I've recorded myself many times, so you do not have to get too fancy. But definitely check things like your lighting. Don't have a bright window behind you, because then it could really make, they might not be able to see you or your face, or just it might be darkened. You can experiment with like a lamp, maybe not directly by you, but bouncing off a wall and giving you some light. Just trying to kind of put yourself in the right, having a consistent lighting, having a look. But again, you don't have to spend money on this. There's a lot you can do to improve your setup without having to spend any money. Quiet space, minimize disruptions when possible. Maybe if you have roommates, ask them to take a walk or go get some food or something for an hour. It's okay to have a pen and paper ready to write notes. And if you're about to use it, I would just say, hey, is it okay if I write notes? To let them know that you're not reading your resume or reading some answers from that. But it's totally fine if you wanted to write notes, like maybe they had a really complex question and you wanted to keep track of what they're saying. Setting up your space to be comfortable. That could be like having water nearby, or maybe some tea, maybe a blanket if the room you're in is a little bit cold. Doing whatever you can to set your environment up and your space so that you're not having to worry about those kind of things. Because an interview itself is hard enough, and to add on some other things could just make it even harder. So the job description is really your guide, and this is your guide for the resume, but very much so for the interview. Those qualifications are all going to be clues on possible questions you're going to get. And now, a typical job description for like a professional role, I could probably create 25, 30 questions off of that. I'm not saying you need to prepare for 30 questions. A lot of times there's themes. You might see a theme, you might see 3 or 4 qualifications that are related to effective communication. So then if I was working with you on preparing you for that job, and by the way, that's something I do on a regular basis. A student will have a job that they're going to interview for. We'll use that job description and we'll just work on that for 50 minutes and just creating questions. The student will try some answers. We'll work on the answers and we'll just focus on that. So that's something that I can offer you. Today's going to be kind of a good overview of that. But if you wanted to do it specifically, that's something that career counselors can offer you. But so like back to the themes, if I was in that setting or in that situation and there were a bunch of questions on effective or qualifications on effective communication, then I would say, what are the elements? What do you think the elements are for effective communication? And that's just a great way to start a general answer, to start thinking about some basics. And if you have an answer for that question, you're probably going to be in pretty good shape for if they ask you a question that's more specific, but it's related to communication. You're probably going to be at least halfway there, if not farther, because you use that general answer. Specific knowledge, things like they want you to know specific software or hardware or specific training. Those are things you're going to want to be ready for, or maybe be ready to talk about, in a sense that you could say, well, I don't actually have experience doing that, but I do know what this program does. I actually use this program that's a lot like it. If I was to get this job, here's how I would cover that, or cover that gap. I would take this training. I know this is online training I could take. So it's pretty rare, especially for a recent college grad, that you are going to qualify for everything that's in the job description. I think you definitely want to qualify for the majority of the big items. A lot of the secondary items, sometimes I just want to have a clue when I walk into that interview of here's what that is. So that if they ask me, I don't say, I don't know what that is. So just ways to do that. I think if you qualify for the majority of a job description, I would apply. And sometimes even if it's less, I would apply as an experiment. Maybe there's something about your history and your education and training that fits what they're looking for. Researching the company is really important. Again, I talked about that before on setting yourself up for maybe understanding what's important to them, but also generating questions for them later. And I will have some examples of some questions that you can ask them, but it's more powerful if you can ask them questions that aren't necessarily canned questions, that are like questions that a lot of people get because they kind of get tired of getting the same question, like, oh, tell me what your job's like, or really basic things like that. Setting up your technology. This is a recent news story. Maybe some of you have seen it, but this is a lawyer. The cat is a lawyer and accidentally turned on his cat filter, couldn't turn it off, and he's saying something like, "I'm not a cat. I'm here live. I'm not a cat." So it just kind of shows you what happens if you don't understand your technology and what can go wrong. I hope this lawyer understands how much humor he's brought to the world and can chuckle about it, but I'm sure it was pretty embarrassing. So again, we talked about internet connection, doing your best on that. That could, trying to find a hotspot. I've used my phone as a hotspot before. If my phone has a good connection, I could do video through my phone. You could test that out. Testing the meeting software is really important. Typically, if you get an interview, they're going to send you an invite and you're going to see what system they're using. If it's something you're really comfortable with, like Zoom, and you understand it pretty well and how to do what you need to do with it, you're probably good to go. If it's something you don't know about, I would download that program. Maybe you can get a free trial. Like WebEx is one that I've seen a lot of companies use, and it works decently differently, or differently than Zoom and maybe Microsoft Teams. And I would download it, make sure that your computer is working with it, that you understand how to get your audio and your video to work, because you don't want to be doing that when you start the interview and maybe you're late because you're trying to figure out the technical stuff. Testing your sound and video. You can record yourself with your webcam. You could try a headset or whatever method you have to see how well it's coming across. And of course, testing your video. With Zoom and a lot of the programs, there's things that you can do that to enhance your appearance. Like I think one of the most popular ones is you can kind of soften your the way your face looks, so it might make you look a little bit more pleasing, or not quite as sharp. Or so you can experiment with that. You don't want to get creative and have like a silly background or anything like that. Try to keep it professional. Using a headset when possible is huge, because what you're doing is this microphone here is hearing my voice much better than it's hearing anything else in the room. My laptop microphone is not very good, and it's going to get a bunch of background noise. If I was to do something on my laptop, you would hear the tapping, and it's just not going to be as good a quality. So trying to use a headset if you can. There are some computers that have good microphones. You can, again, just test it out. I would think it's good. This is a nice to have, not a need, but understanding how to share your screen, whether it's in Zoom or one of these other programs, because you might be dealing with a panel interview and there could be somebody that says, oh, you know what, I don't have your resume. Could you send it to me? Or could you share your resume? We could talk about it on the screen. I don't think that's going to happen often, but I would always know how to do it. It's also going to help for your future. Like I said, virtual meetings and stuff are here to stay. And it's very likely, even maybe within your school, within this term, you might need to share something through a program. And it would be good to know how to do that if it's a different program than you're used to. Keep your items plugged in if possible, unless you know that your battery life is going to be totally fine. What to do if there's an issue during the interview? I think the first thing on that is try to determine if it's something on your side. Let's say that all of a sudden they can't hear you talk. Check your microphone, make sure your cable's plugged in. So check anything on your side that could be the issue, but also understand that they are doing these virtual interviews often, and they're probably going to know, they've probably seen a lot of the technical issues, so probably take their lead on what they suggest. But definitely, if you think it's on your side, then see what you can do. If you're not able to fix it fairly quickly, like within a minute, just like with a lot of computers, just log out and log back in to Zoom and just say, hey, you know what? I think maybe just coming back into the session might reset things. It does work. I've had it work quite a few times when something wasn't working right and we didn't know how to fix it. If it was some kind of video thing and there was just, no matter what you try, you couldn't fix it, and that would be a case where it's like, okay, well, we can keep going with the interview with audio only. Will that work? Or maybe you have to reschedule the interview. So just kind of take their lead on what they would like to do with it. And of course, if there's something on your side, see what you can do. And this is another reason why to practice as much as you can with your technology so that you're not having a problem or having cat face. Mindset. So this can be really important on just projecting your confidence on, there is a bit of fake it till you make it. I kind of like the concept of stretching yourself, trying to think of yourself at your best, your ideal, knowing what you're capable of. And some of that is just remembering. You've probably had many times in your life, high school, wherever, college, maybe sports, maybe work, where you felt like, oh man, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know if I can do this. I think I might fail. All those different feelings. And then you did the work, you got through it, you probably had success often, maybe not all the time, but remembering all those times when you had that feeling of like, oh, this is really hard. I don't know if I can do this. That's a pretty common feeling in an interview. So maybe even spend 15 minutes and write down some notes of those times when it's like, man, I didn't know if I was going to pass this really hard stats class, but I did this, I went to tutoring, I got this help, I really pushed through it, I got through it, and I know that I can do it. I know I've had that success. I know I can have it again. So it's almost like a little pep talk. And if you do write out a sheet or whatever way you do it, take it with you and look at it right before, or not take it with you because your interview is going to be in virtual, but read it before the interview as just a way to remind yourself, like, I know I can do this job. I know I can learn. It doesn't mean I'm going to come in, know everything, not make mistakes, and I'm going to be CEO in 5 years, but just know that you can accomplish a lot because you have accomplished a lot already. Nervous about interviewing? That is a pretty common thing. I would guess probably 95% or more of the population would say that. I've probably had 50 interviews in my life, and I will say that the more you do them, the easier they get. And some of that's just practice, and some of it's just kind of wisdom in the sense of like, I've gotten rejected more than I've gotten my jobs, but I've gotten quite a few jobs, so I know that if I prepare and I do my best, then that's all I can do. But also understand that the interviewers are know that you are going to be nervous, most likely. It's just a given. They're not expecting you to not have any nervousness or make a mistake or fumble through words, or it's so much about adversity. The interview is so much about adversity and seeing how you deal with adversity. The interview itself is an adverse situation. How are you coping? Are you staying calm? Are you staying focused? Are you panicking? Are you shutting down when you don't have a good answer or giving up? There can be a lot of power in having an answer that doesn't go very well, and then the next two answers are great. To show that recovery can be a really powerful statement on your resilience. Also, a lot of the questions they're going to ask you are about adversity. Tell me about a time when you had too much work to do and how you decided what to work on first. Tell me about a time you made a mistake and how you resolved it. They want to see how you react in those adverse situations. So my point is that the interview is supposed to be hard because they want to see how you handle that, and they're not expecting you to be perfect. Self-care during the interview, something that I like to suggest to people doing interviews is when you get asked a question, every time take a little pause. Take a little pause, ponder it, maybe say, oh, that's a good question. Let me think about that for a second. Even if you have the answer ready to go, you're giving yourself a little break. It's a great place to take a deep breath. That deep breath can really change your anxiety level, because a lot of times, your anxiety level might be a 7 or 8. I know it was back in my early days of interviewing, but all these little things that I'm talking about, maybe it will take it down from an 8 to a 6. So a deep breath for every answer. Also, if you build in those pauses, then when you get asked a question that you don't have a great answer for, then you've already kind of set up this routine where you're thinking about that answer. And so you might spend a little more time thinking about that answer, and you won't feel self-conscious about it, thinking that, well, I've answered all these other questions so quickly, and now I'm taking a long time. It just doesn't look good. And you're thinking about all this while you're trying to answer that question. So whatever you can do to build in self-care is great. This reframing and not focusing too much on that interview. This is about not putting all your eggs in one basket. You might be interviewing for that dream job, the job that you've wanted your entire life or whatever, super, super great job. And it's hard not to put a lot of pressure on yourself, or like, oh, I don't know if I got that answer well. I don't know if I'm gonna get this job. I'm a big proponent of always be applying to jobs. When I applied for this job at CWU, I walked out of the interview and I was like, man, I feel like I did pretty well. I don't think I could have done much better. I really want this job, but I am not going to just wait for the answer and look at the phone or hope that I get an email. Next day, I applied to 2 more jobs. Even though this was my primary job, this is the job I wanted. I kept moving forward. A normal job search is going to take 30 to 90 days in normal times. So just kind of understand that job search, interview, all this is, you got to be ready for the long haul. And that's part of this mindset. And don't put too much pressure on that one job or those 2 jobs. Don't think that I'm just going to spend a weekend, I'm going to apply to 20 jobs, and I'm going to wait for all the interview offers to come through. Keep moving forward. There's lots of techniques on how to do the job search, how to do it, and not burn out or go too hard in it. That's something that career counselors can help you with. And if you are really searching for a job, it is a job. And be good to yourself. Schedule it. Don't try to do too much at once. Don't just say, okay, I'm going to spend 8 hours doing job search. It's exhausting. It's hard. Job applications are hard. And so figure out what works best for you on doing that. Common interview questions. One of the first ones that you often get asked is, tell me about yourself. And on the surface, this question to me, and I'm sure some other people, it's like, well, I know myself pretty well. I can talk about myself easily. I don't need to prepare for this one. But then when you sit down in the interview and you have people looking at you, then it's kind of like, oh, wait, do I talk about my history? Do I talk about my hobbies? Do I talk about my trip last summer? Do I talk about just my education? Do I just talk about my work experience? And then it's really easy to ramble and kind of get lost and like, oh crap, am I doing this right? It's also oftentimes that first question, and that can really kind of set the stage on how you feel about the interview. If you feel like you bombed that first question, it might not be a good feeling for the rest of the interview. It might affect your next answers. And there's some different versions of this. It could be, why do you want this job? There's some overlap there. Why are you a good candidate for this job? So there's lots of questions have different versions, different flavors to them. I found this diagram a couple years ago on how to answer this question, and you just break it up into chunks. And it doesn't have to be perfect 30-second chunks. Many of you may not have a rich work history that's worth talking about for 30 seconds. Maybe it's just fast food, retail, service. But if you have work history that's really relevant to the job that you're applying to, then you would talk about it. So I think a lot of you will probably put a lot of effort into the education and training portion, maybe 45 seconds there, and then a summary of the work history. Short bio, that can be kind of difficult. I always tell people to just kind of say, well, I've just making something up off the fly. For me, I I grew up on Eastern Washington. My family's been here for 3 generations. We had a family business doing agriculture. When I was in high school, I took my first psychology class and I fell in love with psychology. And I decided back then that's what I was going to major in college. And then I decided later to go to grad school. I'm kind of making up a story that's partly true for me and partly not. But that's kind of like the bio. You don't need to get personal, but you could say something interesting that's kind of like, oh yeah, well, I was on or I did this project and it turned out to be on TV one time, or if it's related to the career, something that's professional but could be interesting, a little bit of a hook that's like, oh, that's interesting. Like I could use, I'm a World War II buff and I've driven two tanks in my life. I don't know if I would do that in an interview, but it is something interesting I could put that's kind of something they would remember me by. The what's has brought me here today is just like, that would be kind of, I saw this job and the more I read through it, the more I realized that, wow, this is exactly what I'm looking for. And then when I researched the company, I really liked your mission statement and what you stood for. And I decided like, man, I really want to be a part of this company. And that's why I applied for this job. It could be something like that. How do you work under pressure? You could get a lot of versions of that. When you have too much work to do, how do you decide what to work on first? The answer is a lot about prioritization, understanding what I need to work on more, and maybe make a list or work with my manager to make sure I'm working on the things in the right order. Strengths and weaknesses, lots of different versions of this. Could be, tell me 3 strengths you have, tell me 3 weaknesses, or it could be, tell me about a weakness that you have and how you cope with it. And there's a lot of different ways to answer that. Conflict resolution, tell me about a time that you had a conflict with a coworker and how you resolved it, or it could be a customer. And a lot of this are behavior-based questions, and some of you may have had these already or know what this is, but for those of you that don't, anytime you hear a question like, tell me about a time when, or how did you react when this happened, what they want to see is how your past behavior, how you acted in specific situations in the past, because they want to predict how you're going to act in future situations at their company. And I do have a diagram coming up on a good way to answer behavioral-based questions. But first, I want to talk a little bit more about some other questions. So I talked about kind of general questions, and those general questions can be a part of all interviews. And these specific questions would be more specific to the job, and the job description is going to be huge on this. So hard skills like computer software, I know these coding languages. Soft skills, now soft skills are covered a lot in general questions, but a specific one would be, let's say I'm interviewing for a job that's associated with sales, and they say, you are a salesperson for this company, and the last shipment from the customer had a bunch of defective parts, and the customer is really angry. It's your job to go smooth over the issue and try to repair the relationship with the customer. How would you do that? Now that's a hard question, but it's a great way to see how would you approach it. What kind of social intelligence would you use? How would you stay professional, even if they're emotional? So that could be an example of a soft skill question that's very specific. Job specific questions. I used to be a project manager. I had a 20-year career in high tech. And if I was to go interview for a project manager role, I would expect some question like, tell me about the 3 components of project management that are interrelated to each other. And then I would say, well, you have the scope of the project, you have the cost of the project, and you have the timeline. If the scope changes, then either the cost and resources are going to need to increase or the timeline is going to get extended. I would talk about things like that. So the STAR format, this is a way for behavioral-based questions. This does not always work for all questions, like tell me about yourself. This would not work, but the situation, here's the setting, here's what was going on, here is the action or the actions I took, and here's the result. And when you can quantify that result, it's really powerful. An example that I've used in the past is in my previous career, I was a project manager. I was relying on a software developer to work on my project items. And so was this other project manager. And we were kind of pulling this software developer in different directions. And that software developer was getting frustrated, and we weren't getting our stuff done when we wanted to get done. So the action that I took was I set up a meeting with all 3 of us. We figured out what are the most priority parts of our project. We set up a schedule. And by doing this, the result was that the software developer was much happier and able to do his job more effectively. And each project manager was able to have a very clear schedule on when we were going to get our items done. And then we could tell our customers when that stuff would be due or done. So I talked about questions for employers. So these are a little bit canned, but they would be much better than nothing. And you can also do versions of these questions. But I think if you're somebody that wants to keep learning, want to keep growing, I think that's a great question to ask, in the sense of, hey, what is somebody in this job role? How do they typically advance? Or what are some opportunities? Because I'm a lifelong learner. I want to keep learning. I want to keep growing. What are ways that people do that within your company? What are the best things about working at your company? That's kind of a canned one, but it's much better than nothing. What are the most significant challenges, or maybe what are some challenges that people starting out in this role usually have? What are the aspects that make a successful employee in this role? There's lots of ways to ask that as well. But that's actually you thinking ahead, in the sense of, if I get hired here, I already want to figure out how to be successful. Also, if you don't get the job, this could be useful, this information, for another job that's like it, where if you had another interview for that same job role, you would have a little more information, maybe something you could talk about in your interview. And again, the job description and company research. is really useful to create other examples. And I would encourage you to create other examples, but these are and you can find lists of these on the internet, but I would always have some good ones in your back pocket to use, but try to think of some custom ones that would be more specific to that job you're interviewing for. Practicing in detail. So always practice your answers and your presence. So basics on answers. Like I said before, like 90 seconds is a good average. Sometimes a little bit longer, sometimes a little bit shorter. Posture, sitting up straight, pulling your shoulders back. And now I'm going to do it because I'm reading it. But sometimes that can really put you into more of a confident frame of mind. There is some research that shows that when people do that, sometimes they feel more confident. Again, practicing yourself. You have a webcam or your phone or whatever you're going to use, you can practice that. Practice them out loud. That's so important. I tell people even just writing a paper, if I'm writing an important email, I read it out loud because we'll catch mistakes that we don't see by reading it. Having eye contact with the webcam, it's not that you have to stare into the webcam the whole interview, but think about ways that maybe you can minimize the window of the person that you're speaking to or the group of people, and you can make that window, you can move it up to the top of your screen so that the person I'm looking at is up right here now, and that it kind of looks like I'm looking at the webcam. Like the difference between me looking at the webcam and the screen is not that big, so it might look like I'm looking at them. It could be a way to kind of give that impression. Including other strengths into answers. This is something that's a nice to have, but you don't have to try to do this. But let's say that you get asked a question like, tell me about a time you resolved a conflict with a customer. And you can say, well, in my previous experience, I've worked with a diverse population of customers, and I learned that it's really important to meet the customer where they are, and not to make assumptions. And using those principles, here's how I manage this conflict. What you're doing is you're answering the conflict question, but you're also inserting some social intelligence in the sense of don't make assumptions, meet the client or the customer where they are. You worked with a diverse population. You're bringing in these other strengths and skills into this answer. And sometimes you might have some strengths and skills you really wanted to display, but they're not asking a question about it. And that's a way that you can put that in. Sometimes you'll also get a question near the end of the interview on, is there anything else about you that you want us to know? And that's a place where you can do that as well. Last couple details, dressing professionally. We do have some tips and a career guide on our career services webpage. We have this diagram in our career guide, so you can get some useful ideas there. We do have a clothing closet, so if you don't have access to professional clothing, we can help you with that. Right now, you just make an appointment and we will get you into that clothing closet. Following up is really important. It's professional, it's courteous, it really can set you apart from people that don't do it. And email would be the minimum. Don't do text. I would stay away from the phone. And back in non-pandemic days, there can be a lot of power in a written old school mail follow-up, like a thank you card. I knew this hiring manager, and she had a thank you card on her desk from an employee after an interview, and she had that card on her desk for 4 years because it meant so much to her. So it's a great way to stand out. Nice personal touch. Okay, so that was a lot of talking, and I just want to see if your opinion on virtual interviewing has changed. It doesn't have to. It wasn't my intent to say, oh, virtual interviewing is great and you should change your opinion. I'm just curious with everything I went through if it has changed. So I'm just going to launch the second poll. And it's anonymous again. Wow. It's a lot of people are saying it looks easier. So I guess that's good. Okay, so I will share the results. Quite a different set of results. So that's kind of good to hear because in the near future, your interviews are most likely going to be virtual. And like I said, there's probably going to be more virtual interviewing happening as the future goes, whether there's a pandemic or not. So glad to see that maybe it's not quite as scary as it looked. All right, so I actually talked a lot longer, or a little bit longer than I expected, but we still got about 15 minutes. Does anybody have any questions on what I talked about, going into something I talked about more deeply, or maybe I didn't cover something that you want to know about? And you can unmute yourself and talk. You can put it in the chat. You can also privately chat me if you don't want to. If you want to be anonymous, I won't say who sent me a question.
So you had you like talked about finding a quiet space, but what about like what sort of backgrounds are appropriate versus not appropriate? Like I am currently living in my parents' house.
Mm-hmm.
Childhood bedroom. We don't really have an office space. I'm sitting in one of my spare, like I have a room in it that's adjoined to my bedroom, but it has a bunch of my personal stuff behind me. So
Mm-hmm.
what type of stuff do we need to eliminate from the camera view?
You know, I don't think there's anything wrong with your space behind you right now. In fact, that image that's on your left side from your perspective actually looks kind of cool. So I don't think there's anything wrong with that. A blank wall is just fine as well. I think just stay away from things that might give the impression of like not professional. But a blank wall would work too. Some people hang a sheet.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, good question. And like I said earlier on, a question that you have is probably something that's going to be helpful for the other students. So please help us out. And I would love to have this be more of a discussion and not just have me talk a lot longer.
Yeah, so I actually have it's more specific. I actually did a virtual interview a month ago with the city in actually Arizona.
Mhm.
And it went well because they actually called me back and now they want to do an in-person interview.
Wow.
Um, so I was kind of taken back by that. And I was kind of nervous, like what should I do? So of course I was like, okay, it's all expenses paid, I'll go do it. But now I'm thinking like what precautions do I need to take like professionally? Like do I walk in with a mask? Do I like typically I'm a handshaker, but now do I like fist bump them? Is that elbow like what like how do I approach it? And it they're in Arizona, I'm in Washington, so
Yeah.
things are different there.
Yeah, great question. And kind of a rare question these days. Not a lot of in-person ones, but I would definitely go. And I would just err on the side of caution. I would wear a mask to begin with completely and kind of gauge what they're doing. If they're not wearing masks, doesn't mean you have to take yours off. Don't do something that you're not comfortable with. On the sense of like a personal greeting or everything, you could just start out just like at a distance to say, oh, distance handshake. It's just a way to kind of broach that and make it kind of comfortable. And then they might say, well, I don't mind giving a handshake, and then you can decide if you want to or not. But or you could just ask them like, hey, I know handshakes are very common here. Is there anything that you're doing instead? It's kind of a tough time to decide what's right or wrong on that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I would check the state of the place that you're going to in the sense of, do they have phases? What's their
Okay.
infection rate? How bad is it? As a way to kind of gauge how careful you should be.
Yeah, so it's interesting because I felt like they used the virtual interviewing process as like a prelim.
Mm-hmm.
And I even emailed them. I was like, I only want to fly out if like I'm like a serious candidate. So
That's fair because it's your time.
yeah,
You probably have some things going on like school.
I work full time. I don't need another job, but
Yeah, exactly,
I'm
exactly.
always the door's always open if a better opportunity presents itself.
No, it's great, and I think you have a good mindset on it too, because you're probably going to learn something no matter what, especially if it's the kind of career you're looking at.
Thank you.
Yeah, good question. Anyone else?
I have a somewhat specific question.
Mm-hmm.
I thought of a question that I could potentially ask an interviewer, and I kind of just wanted to run it by you to see
Yeah.
if it was appropriate. or not? And the question is like, is it okay to ask about like the future of the company and where they plan on improving their company, or is that something that you would ask after you get hired? Yeah.
Yeah, good question. I think I would just slightly reframe that question. I would say, you know, your company is focusing on this. I've seen, or maybe you've seen a news article or you've seen something on their website where they're thinking about going into this or they're starting to branch into that. I would just say, yeah, you know, most companies are always trying to grow. Do you have ways or goals or ideas on how you think this company is going to grow? Because I would love to be a part of that. And so you're kind of saying like, you're kind of asking it, but you're not, I would not ask something like, how are you going to get better? Because that might, they might take that as like, oh, do you think there's something wrong? Are we not doing something right? It's like, so but I think it's a great question in the sense of like, yeah, what do you see for the future of this company? Most companies are always changing, or are you just gonna keep getting better at what you're doing? Because it could lead to a great conversation in the sense of, especially if you had any ideas.
Thank you.
Yeah. These are great questions. Thank you for bringing these up.
I have a question about like when joining a virtual interview. So I'm assuming that it's probably better to join earlier than, well, before the time when the interview is going to happen. But would it be better to leave before the interviewers, after the interview is done, or would you wait for the interviewers to log off and them to terminate the interview?
Good question. Number one, if you felt very comfortable with the software system, I would probably log in 5 minutes before just to make sure there's no issues with just this specific login, because I've been using Zoom hundreds of times, but every once in a while there's something that will happen. It's like, oh, that's weird. I'll just log in again. If it's something that you don't have as much experience with, but you've done some practice like I talked about, then maybe 10 minutes or 8 minutes. I wouldn't log in a half an hour unless it's just like, I'm just making sure it logs in, because they're probably going to see that you logged in. So it's not going to look bad, but if you were to like stay logged in, that could look kind of weird. Like, why is he here a half an hour early and just hanging around? Once in a while with Zoom and maybe some of the other services, they're using the same link to do multiple things. Like my career counseling, I use the same link all the time. And I use the waiting room to allow people in one by one. So you might run into that, and that's not a big deal. If you logged in 10 minutes early and then you saw that you were in a waiting room and you decide, okay, I'll just log in when 2 minutes before, you can just say, yeah, I just want to make sure my login was working appropriately. It's going to show that you want to not have any issues. It's kind of a good look for you. On the ending of the interview, if you feel like you've said everything, they've said everything, you said your goodbyes and you know, take care or whatever, all those different things, I would log off, because especially if everybody's working remotely now, so they might want to have a conversation after that. And if you were hanging around, they might think, oh, why is he still hanging around? So as long as you feel like it's ended and everything, you said all the goodbyes and thank yous and all that, then I would just log off.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, good question. Anyone else? And if you had anything on just interviewing or just questions about career services or what we can do, I talked about how I go through this process with people. I worked with a student last summer. I think we had 5 or 6 appointments. We started with a job search. We found some jobs. We talked about resume, cover letter. Then we talked about interviewing, and we went through this whole thing. So this is why we're here.
Do you by chance have like 10 or 15 minutes following this? Because I fly out tomorrow morning for my interview.
Sure.
If I could bounce off I want to create some follow-up questions.
Sure. Definitely. Anyone else? interview questions or just any career development related things, or how to make an appointment with us, or how to access our website. Awesome. Well, just know that this workshop is being recorded. Most workshops are being recorded. We do have a YouTube channel where we put these. And so if there was a workshop that you wanted to see or watch again, you can access those. And yeah, we have resources on career services. And also, last thing is that a lot of students don't know this, but as CWU students, you have access to career services for life, which is a lot of colleges don't do. It's usually like a year. So it's a pretty good feature. I met with a student that graduated 5 years ago last week. All right, if there's no more questions, then thank you for coming, and thanks for the questions and participation, and good luck to all of you, and maybe I'll see you at some point in another workshop or an appointment. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anthony or Nathalia, do you have a question? Oh, looks like where can I rewatch the workshop? It will be on our YouTube channel. If you go to our career services page and you look at our workshops, actually, let me just show you that really briefly. So any CWU homepage, if you go to student success, and sorry if you already know this, but maybe this will help anybody else that has a similar question. Student services, career services. And then on this page is attend a career services workshop. And this is where we have our schedule of upcoming workshops, but we also have our YouTube channel. Our website just went through a big revision and some things aren't quite working yet. So if you have an issue, let me know and I can give you a direct link to this YouTube channel. But right now we're doing a lot of virtual workshops. We're getting a lot of good attendance. So we're probably going to keep doing virtual workshops in some capacity, even when things go back to normal.